G20 Finance Ministers have agreed on a new framework for restructuring government debt. Ross Cullen has more.
The coronavirus crisis has affected nearly every country in the world, but the pandemic has amplified economic problems in nations that were already struggling with high debt burdens. The G20 group of leading world players has announced a framework to help those countries with mounting payments due to creditors. G20 Finance Ministers have agreed to suspend debt service payments for 77 low-income countries. The World Bank estimates that highly indebted countries owe nearly $14 billion in 2020. National governments comprise 45% of the creditors. Multilateral lenders like the IMF and private lenders make up the rest. But this deal only looks at suspending payments. Campaigners argue a full cancellation of all debts is needed to avoid economic stagnation and increased poverty.
We've seen unprecedented economic action by the EU, by the UK, by the US to support their own economies. And just a small drop of that is needed to tackle this debt problem in the poorest countries. But it is vital, otherwise the next 10 years will be a lost decade.
Some economists are warning of challenges trying to get all the creditors to agree on further debt restructuring. That's because the makeup of the lenders is no longer just the Paris Club of rich countries who have historically lent money to developing nations.
The pool of the creditors is different. And so the moment you have to negotiate that restructuring, it means that at the table, they have to see different players. It's not only the Paris Club, but you have to bring in China and other emerging donors, and you have to bring in the private creditor. And this is probably at the moment the most challenging situation, because it's difficult then to have everyone agree on the same terms.
French President Emmanuel Macron was one of the first G20 leaders to call for a new deal on debt. But now France has had to prop up its own pandemic-hit economy to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
All right, we have with us Ken Gichinga, the chief economist at Mentoria Economics, joining us live via Zoom from Nairobi. Ken, thanks for joining us here on Africa Live. Let's get straight into it. African nations are worried about a possible U-turn from some of the G20 nations on promises about debt relief. What do you see happening in this regard?
Well, many thanks, Richard. I don't expect to see a U-turn from the G20 countries. These type of contracts tend to be signed on ink and paper, so I don't expect to see a U-turn. What I'm worried about is when the conversation is only about debt relief. Yes, 40% of sub-Saharan countries are facing major debt distress. But if we only link the conversation to debt relief, we might miss out on the bigger point, which is we need an expanded vision for Africa. We need to see businesses coming up. We need to see entrepreneurs coming up. So what I hope to see is the beginning of a business revolution in Africa, and that needs to be on the conversation equally with the equal importance.
All right. Important points that you've made there. It seems, though, that everyone is struggling at this time, yet the UN is asking for, listen to this, at least $28 billion more for COVID-19 vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. What is the best and worst case scenario here?
I think the best case scenario is, yes, the UN is able to mobilize the resources that can contain the pandemic and obviously help countries with things around things such as sanitizers and things that can contain the pandemic. But I think it's very important that the UN also prepares the countries for a new economy, what is called the new economy, post-COVID economy. Because as we speak, so many businesses have shut down, people have been laid off. And remember, next year, the UN has declared next year to be the year of the creative economy. So I think the best case scenario is, yes, contain the pandemic, but prepare businesses to be able to compete in the new creative economy that's coming up. I think the worst case scenario is when they only look at one area and neglect the fact that millions of people are falling into poverty, falling into unemployment. If they ignore that second part, then we're going to have, that's, I think, in my opinion, the worst case scenario.
All right, Ken, let's discuss my final question. China is giving at least $2.1 billion in debt relief to poor countries. Will this trigger similar response among other rich nations? How do you see it?
Well, that's a good point because there is often an element of geopolitics to these financial transactions. And yes, China has made a lot of inroads within Africa and the West, particularly in the United States. There is a feeling that they need to catch up with the traction that China has made across Africa. So that in of itself could trigger more aid coming from the Western countries, if only to keep up with what China is doing. But I think the grand picture has to be about Africa. It has to be about the economy, whether the money is coming from the East or the West. Africans need to start getting back onto their feet, and they need to start conducting business and creating wealth and prosperity.
Ken Gajinga, economist, live from Nairobi, speaking to us. Ken, thank you for your time.